and that nothing wrong happens to the people underneath it. I wanted to welcome you all to today's book launch and the panel that we prepared as part of this launch, and I would like to welcome Professor Agnieszka Graff to open this officially for us.
Is it very interesting here? I want to say it's a great opportunity, great reason for a celebration today. Books and book launches are rare occurrences in the lives and careers of academic authors. Of course, this is truer of some academics than of others. Professor Agnieszka Graff and Professor Elżbieta Korolczuk are very dynamic and very prolific authors. I want to welcome everyone and want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank our two authors, our distinguished speakers, and the distinguished guests. We've been joined by some very distinguished guests for this occasion. I also would like to thank all the students joining us and all the people who have tuned in to listen to or watch us on Facebook. This event is being streamed on Facebook. I can only express my delight and my pride in the fact that the American Studies Center has become is an important place of important recognized research. Research that is published by important publishing houses like Routledge. Thank you very much. I yield the floor to Dr. Usiekniewicz, who will tell us more about the guests that agreed to read the book and share their thoughts about it early, before the official reviews arrived in journals. So I yield the floor to Dr. Usiekniewicz, who will tell us more about the guests and our authors. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we demask? Because I think the mask plus a large room might be tough. Okay. Thank you, Professor Kosz, for this opening talk. And I wanted to introduce our panel. I agree it's incredibly distinguished and also very fun. So I'm sure that we're in for 90 minutes of intellectual entertainment. I mean, both intellectual and entertainment. So with us today are obviously the two authors of the book, Agnieszka Graff and Elżbieta Korolczuk. So let me, yes, if anyone, please wave if the intensive social media presence of the two registered in your head and you don't know their faces. So, Elżbieta Korolczuk is a sociologist, commentator, women's and human rights activist. She's an associate professor at the American Studies Center and at, oh, I'm so sorry, so that one? Yes, right. University in Stockholm, researching issues related to anti-gender, social movements, civil society, and politics of reproduction. She published numerous texts, for example, on women's movements and neoliberalism, new forms of citizenship, politicization of reproduction, and anti-gender mobilization. Her most recent publications include a volume co-authored with Beata Kowalska, Jennifer Rane, and Klaudia Snochowska-Gonzalez, Bunt Kobiet, Czarne Protesty i Strajki Kobiet. This was published in 2019, and obviously we are here book launching your most topic. And next to her is Agnieszka Graff, an associate professor at the American Studies Center, University of Warsaw, where she teaches courses in American cultural studies, literature, gender studies, and African American studies. Her main interest is in the intersection between gender, sexuality, and nationalism. Her articles have been published in collected volumes in academic journals. She has authored 5 books of feminist essays in Polish, the best known being Świat bez kobiet. She co-edited the spring 2019 themed issue of Science, Gender, and the Rise of the Global Right. Agnieszka Graff is an activist and public intellectual, co-organizer and speaker of Congress of Polish Women, regular contributor to major journals and newspapers. And the people commenting on the book and offering their takes are Michał Bilewicz, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Warsaw, where he chairs the Center for Research on Prejudice. He serves also as the chair of the Scholarly Advisory Board at Forum for Dialogue, a non-profit organization working on Polish-Jewish relations. His main research focus is psychology of intergroup relations, particularly such topics as stereotyping and prejudice. He proposed the 3-factorial structure of anti-Semitic belief, a model that is widely cited in contemporary psychological literature on the topic. He designed numerous interventions aiming at reducing prejudice based on contact hypotheses and moral exemplars approach. Patrycja Sasna is a political scientist, Arabist, and philosopher. She works as the head of research at Polish Institute of International Affairs and mentor of the Academy of Migration at College of Europe. She is an expert of the Advisory Committee of the United Nations Human Rights Council. She is a member of the European Council of Foreign Relations Council. Okay, that's the Polish language phrase, like, you cannot repeat the same word, try it. Editing to me. And the Polish Ombudsman's Office Expert Commission on Migration. She specializes in Middle Eastern politics, migration, and political violence. She has written for The Guardian, Le Monde, and Politica. Her latest book is Arendt, Fanon, and Political Violence in Islam. Tomasz Basiuk is a cultural studies scholar and director of the Institute of America and Europe, of which the American Studies Center is a part. Professor Basiuk's research interests include contemporary American fiction and life writing, critical theory, and queer studies. He has authored 2 monographs and edited or co-edited 6 volumes and special journal issues in American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies. He is a founding co-editor of Inter Alia, a queer studies e-journal established in 2006. He was the primary investigator in a Hera-founded queer history project, COSEF, and is a Fulbright alumnus. And finally, and I'm sorry for if you cannot see her because I'm sitting in front of her, is Ludmila Janion, a cultural studies scholar and assistant professor at the American Studies Center. Her research and teaching interests include media, gender and sexuality studies. In her doctoral dissertation, she analyzed the westernization of discourses of gender nonconformity during the transition era in Poland. Her new project investigates how neoliberalism influenced heteromasculinity in the 1990s. And I'm out of breath because you're very impressive. I wanted to... Oh, and my name is Marta Usiekniewicz, and I also work at the American Studies Center. So, I wanted to kick us off by asking the 2 authors to give us the brief take on your book. What did you do? Why? And how did it come about? And also, I want to share with everyone, both in the room and online, that today's discussion is supposed to be kind of a sample of how incredible this book is, because you can check it out for yourself, because this book is available in open access. So those of you who are online right now can actually, while we have this talk, go and download your own copy from the publisher's website. So just so you know. Agnieszka, hello? Please.
I guess I will start, and I must say that I'm very nervous because we have been working on this for so long, and this is the first moment where we have a panel of specialists, of great scholars, who might tear this book apart. And on the one hand, I feel like they should, because there are so many things that we didn't manage to include in that. But on the other hand, of course, I feel very vulnerable about it, because I just checked that the first public presentation that we did together with Agnieszka at the conference on this topic was in 2014. So as you can imagine, we got pretty attached to this issue over the years. And of course, our first interest was a reaction are not particularly Polish in that sense. And this is something that we should look at from a transnational perspective. And that's when we started to look at it from very different perspectives. And basically, we have been working on this book for the last 4 years, I think, trying to combine different perspectives and also trying to give a sense of how can we theorize, how can we understand those scattered events, and how can we make sense of the transnational connections of what we call anti-gender movement. And of course, we are very grateful to great scholars, a lot of them actually, who have done wonderful research on this topic, because now there is a sort of growing community of researchers and also activists who are dealing with these issues. And in the Polish context, there have been groups by Maciej Duda, for example, on these anti-gender campaigns in the Polish context. There have been a group by on a specific aspect of this political transnational aspect. And what we try to do is to use our knowledge and our expertise in gender studies, sociology, cultural studies, to give a sort of broader picture, but also to give conceptual tools to analyze various manifestations of this trend worldwide. And basically, this analysis comes down to two major issues. One is the analysis of the opportunistic synergy between anti-gender movement and the right-wing populists in Poland, but also beyond Poland. Because, of course, anti-feminism, opposition to LGBTQ rights, opposition to new family forms is not new, right? We know that it has been going on for quite a long time, but it got, it really had a momentum from a specific point of time because of a specific opening in the political opportunity structure, right? So this is exactly what we are analyzing. And what we call this opportunistic synergy is basically both ideological alliance, organizational cooperation, and also affective connection between those two groups, which in the public discourse are often lumped together, right? The right. But we believe that we really have to be very careful in distinguishing between different actors who have different agendas and also different ideological allegiances. And in that sense, this connection between right-wing populists and anti-genderists has been facilitated by three important elements. First of all, one element is the laicization or the tendency on the religious fundamentalists, on the part of religious fundamentalists, to promote or construe their message, not necessarily in religious terms, but in terms of human rights, opposition to discrimination, support for women's rights, and so on and so forth. So secularization of religious discourse is something that is incredibly important here. Another element, the second one, is the fact that the anti-gender discourse is very much structured as a populist one. This is basically rooted in the division between us and them, between elites and the people, and of course it is a deeply moralizing take on this position. It's not only about who has the power, but it's also about who is morally right and wrong, and who is evil. And this is the moment where the discussion around certain issues becomes a struggle to delegitimize specific types of actors and to sort of marginalize them within the public sphere. And then the third element is the question of family. Because as we know from, we are here at the American Studies Center, so we know very well how the conservative movements and actors in the United States have used this issue of family and family rights and support for the family in various ways since the 70s. But here we have a different configuration, because in the context of Europe, and Poland and Hungary are very vivid examples of this trend. The cultural issue of family values is very much connected with what we call, following other scholars, right-wing take on welfare chauvinism. So this is what makes this proposal a very convincing one. And this is something that we which really mobilize people and attract people. But on the one hand, you have the issue of family values as a normative proposition. On the other hand, it is very much backed up by specific types of pro-natalist, selective, chauvinist family policies. And the second element of our conclusions concerns the relationship between this trend and neoliberalism. Because we believe that the anti-gender movement basically promotes itself, portrays itself as a conservative response to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism understood not only as the greed of the markets or the precarization of living and working conditions, but also as a set of cultural values such as individualism, such as the dignity of the family, such as alienation. So in a way, this is a response to actually existing needs and wants and issues that quite a lot of people struggle with, which makes it incredibly effective. And in that sense, in a sense, this struggle happens in the context of what we call, following quite a lot of scholars, the populist moment. Kasmu was talking about the populist moment in the sense of the crisis of democracy, but of course there are many scholars who show that these are multiple crises. The crisis of democracy, the crisis of welfare state, the crisis of neoliberalism in a sense. So this is the moment where different forces struggle for the recognition as the people, right? So this is the most important question in the sense of democracy. Who are the people? Who are the we in democracy? And in the book we try to show both sides of this struggle. The right-wing forces and anti-gender movement who claims the we, the people, for themselves, but also the feminist movement, especially since 2016 in Poland, where it became a mass movement, which says, well, no, we are the people. We want to make claims as those who are working from the grassroots level up, who are representing the citizens of Poland. So I think that these three elements are probably the most important ones. I'm sure Agnieszka will have a lot to say too.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity also to thank Dan Sachs, who's here and who helped us fine-tune the text, who will be remembered forever in the history of scholars of anti-genderism.
My pleasure.
And also I'd like to thank Karolina Baka for making this event happen. Elżbieta has sketched for you the main theoretical framings that we offer in our book. The one that we actually are quite proud of inventing, the term opportunistic synergy between right-wing populist parties and religious movements. The idea that anti-genderism is a response to neoliberalism, although they would never use the word. It's another language for critiquing, attacking, and finding solutions to what the left calls neoliberalism. I would like to focus on the cultural studies aspect of this story. I came to this phenomenon with a set of questions and curiosities about the imagery, about the metaphors, the stories that anti-genderism tells. And in part, in conversation with Elżbieta, and in part because of my way of reading texts in general, we came up with this idea that as much as we disagree with these people, as much as we don't share their story of the world, we need to believe that they believe what they're saying. And that the question that we're asking is not, why are they saying these terrible things, but rather, what is the internal structure, the internal logic of these things? How do they feel to the people who listen to them? Why is there, why is there the capacity, what does this discourse owe its capacity to draw people in the streets? And some of the events, the anti-gender events that we followed in the media, and Elżbieta followed some of them in person, are quite impressive. For instance, the Mariusz Puchtus demonstrations were as large as 70,000 people in 2012. I think that's the peak. The attack against Judith Butler in Brazil brought about 100,000 people in the street. So, you could start with the assumption that these people are duped or manipulated, but you could also sort of waive that question and ask, well, what are they thinking? And we ended up putting together an interpretation of what we see as a fairly consistent worldview behind anti-genderism, a worldview that has its own way of making sense of the world, that has its own characteristic imagery, filled with certain recognizable metaphors, images, and narratives. And I'd just like to list a few of them for you. And some of them will seem familiar, some of them are more context-specific and have simply not arrived in Poland, maybe yet. So first, there is a declension narrative behind all this. There is an idea that the world is coming to pieces, that the genderists or the gender ideologues are destroying a culture which was fine until they came. And then there is a set of different versions of the story which take it back as far as the sexual revolution of the 60s or Freud, or in fact the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And I got quite interested in those differences between the theories, and also in the anti-Semitic subtexts in some but not all of them. Then there is the persistent opposition between the ordinary people and the elites, which Elżbieta mentioned, and which is part of this robust frame that we call the populist frame. But there's also the distinction between the local and the global. And this is something that you don't notice if you're just observing this phenomena in one place, like in Poland. It's persistent. Conservatism is always framed as local, authentic, belonging to the people here who live their ordinary lives in their loving families, whereas genderism is always construed as global, a form of colonialism. And actually our theorizing of this phenomenon started with this, with noticing that they use colonization as one of the frames. There are also diseases. We had our moment when we were fascinated by the claim that gender is Ebola from Brussels, and we have evidence that this is actually an existing frame. We have a picture of a banner saying that. And of course you're familiar with Bishop Jędraszewski's claim that LGBTQ ideology is a plague. There were comparisons to COVID and other diseases. And of course this imaginary has a long history. We also ended up looking at images that appear in many different places, in slightly different versions. Terrified children, often as background to slogans. And sometimes as speakers in movies, terrified children who speak to the viewer asking to be rescued. Empty homes, invasions. There were also some that appeared only in certain contexts, such as the idea that genderism is a way of selling the family, that it's a way of commercialization of intimate life. This came up a lot in France. There is a whole wing of the anti-gender movement that if you look at it at first, it looks like they're basically battling commercialization and capitalism. And then you look a little bit closer and you see that it's all about the selling of babies, and the selling of babies is of course surrogacy. So to conclude, as much as I love our big frames, I also became attached to our little discoveries, those little, this mapping of the imaginary of the anti-gender movement. And while I appreciate the importance of religious sources, political alliances, and probably economic reasons in the end for the rise of anti-genderism, it's not a coincidence that its greatest successes happened right after the 2008 economic crisis. We also insist throughout the book that none of this can be, that none of this should lead us to omit the cultural dimension. This is a robust cultural project, and if it has been so successful in getting people on board, it's because it does offer a story about human life and about the meaning of life, which neoliberalism doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. And if my earlier call for a download wasn't forceful enough. I think that after listening to the two of you, that everyone is frantically downloading their own copy, legally. That's key moment here. I wanted now to ask our panelists to kind of give their take on what they've read. I think you represent kind of different aspects of the issues that this book relates to. And maybe I can start with Michał Bilewicz and your take on anti-gender politics in the populist moment.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for this great opportunity to talk about the first such book that summarizes the issue of new conspiracy theory, the gender conspiracy, which is, we've been studying conspiracy theories since many years, and it's quite rare that you see a new conspiracy theory being developed from scratch within 20 years. So this is why I find this book really something seminal, really important, and very timely. I realized that something like a gender conspiracy theory about alleged gender ideology exists when I read, it was approximately 10 years ago, an interview with Father Dariusz Oko in Nasz Dziennik. And in the interview, there was one statement from him which impressed me a lot. Unfortunately, I have to read it in Polish because you can translate it to English, but in Polish it sounds even more powerful. Genderyści lubią działać w ukryciu, po cichu jak mafia. Chcą przeprowadzić swoją rewolucję odgórnie poprzez przejęcie ośrodków władzy i mediów. Żerują na niewiedzy obywateli, aby obejść procedury demokratyczne i siłowo narzucić swoją ideologię. When I read it, immediately I wrote to my colleagues working in the area of conspiracy theories, read this statement. Every single sentence from this statement sounds like an item from a conspiracy mentality scales that we've been using since years to measure people's tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. For example, conspiracy theories about the Jewish conspiracy. Genderists like to operate in secret, silently, like the mafia. Right? So this is very essential core of the conspiracy theory. They want to carry out the revolution from above by taking over the centers of power and the media. So there are some centers and they want to take control over them. They prey on citizens. They exploit the citizens' ignorance to bypass democratic procedures and impose their ideology by force. So also the alleged the force of the gender ideology. And then I sent it around. It was more or less a joke. And then years after that, some of my colleagues, in fact, developed what we call until today Oko scale. The scale to measure belief in gender conspiracy. And there are works by Marta Usiekniewicz, Aleksandra Cichowska, who really analyze what are the sources of that, what is the mechanism behind it, what motivation drive people to believe in the conspiracy theories about gender. Now, what I learned from the book that I didn't know about gender from the works of my colleagues who are studying these conspiracy theories. And many of these things are very much relevant to what we know about the beliefs in Jewish conspiracy. First thing, inspiration by the Vatican and by Catholic clergy. I didn't know that it was actually created at the core of the Roman Catholic Church. Exactly the same as historically the belief in Jewish conspiracy. But in case of anti-Semitism, and then of course it approaches, it secularizes, and it becomes of the secularized discourse. And this is how it exists today in many European societies. In Polish politics, it's a very important mobilizing force, as we show for the populist politicians, completely regardless of its religious character. This process, in case of anti-Semitism, took more than 1,800 years to create a secularized version of this Catholic-created imagery. In this case, it's 20 years. It's 20 years, it's so fast, but the process is the same. The second issue, which I found fascinating in this book, is showing the anti-colonial aspect of the anti-gender conspiracy ideology. the Ebola from Brussels, the Brussels forces that want to colonize Eastern Europe particularly. Very similar to anti-colonial aspects of anti-Semitism. Perception of Jews as the agents of westernization, of liberalism, in the Mediterranean world of Italy, in I don't know, Rhodes, for example, of France, as you know, part of Alliance Française and the French colonizing power in the Middle East. These images of Jews as being the agents of colonial powers was very similar to the ones that you present here. And the problem is that the authors of the book suggest that this is the culturalization of anti-colonialism, that it misses the real power structures, the real economic aspects of colonialism, setting up just this cultural narrative of anti-colonialism. And in that respect, I find your book very similar to the socialist understandings of anti-Semitism. What Bebel was writing about anti-Semitism as the socialism for the fools, right? So this is kind of anti-colonialism for the fools. And the final thing that you also very nicely show in this work, protection of our endangered families and endangered children. This fear about children, that this ideology might devastate the mentality of our children, that it's dangerous for the safety of our children, equalizing pedophilia with homosexuality, a very important aspect of this conspiracy theory. Very central for the populist right today, very important for fear-mongering and for creating a pogrom-like atmosphere around that. And again, it resembles very much what we know about anti-Semitism, about Kielce pogrom, and about other pogroms in which also the blood libel accusation was actually based on the same fear about children. They are posing danger to our children. And now, referring to we are in the American Studies institution, it is also a very important mobilizing factor for the current conspiracy theorists in the States, the QAnon conspiracy, which is also around fear of the network of pedophiles that are conquering American politics. So I think that this gender ideology is part of the general fear mongering about children today. And now, religious in a narcissistic sense, so they are not safe and secure in their religious identity. Their religious identity is fragile, is uncertain, and this brings narcissism, right? And this is why they are so panicking when they see any this gender ideology makes them uncertain about their own religiosity. This is why it's so popular in Russia. This is why Russia is such a driving force, as you show in your book perfectly, because Russia, Eastern Europe. When we look at the cross-country comparisons on homophobia, for example, and homonegativity, we find that the highest levels of homophobia are in Poland, Georgia, Azerbaijan, in the post-Soviet bloc, right? In the places where they are expressions of religiosity, but a kind of constructed religiosity, a new religiosity, in countries that were secularized. And they have this simple religious narrative, so in those regions that have very traditional religious structures, Bavaria, it's not such a mobilizing force as it is, for example, in Orthodox Russia, Russia that rediscovered its orthodoxy. And another aspect of this, so a part of this narcissistic religiosity, which can be behind that, there is also an interesting aspect of the. You suggest that it's part of the populist policy. And when you think about this in current Europe and beyond, the anti-gender conspiracy theory is something that really distinguishes the populist extremist right wing from the conservative right wing. So it's not part of the conservative. So this is why, for example, Polish Law and Justice now localizes itself not among the conservatives, not together with the Tories, with the British conservatives, not with Likud in Israel, because there is a fraction of Likud, which is called Likud Prime, because there is a fraction of conservative party in Britain, which is called LGBT plus conservatives. Nothing like that could ever exist in Law and Justice. Nothing like that could ever exist in AfD in Germany. Maybe in AfD would be a little bit more tolerated, but still, these fringe parties, the extremist parties, this is this is what distinguishes them from the right. And now finally the solutions. Last thing that I want to say, sorry for exploiting the time, but the solution, you suggested that one of the solutions might be more populist turn among the feminist movement, which I found very thought-provoking idea. And when thinking about some aspects of the recent feminist mobilization in Poland, I think Polish feminism in fact is gaining some sense of populism in the recent years. When I think about the women's strike and organizations around that. But I don't think that we really need the populism to destroy this conspiracy theory. Because the conspiracy theories like that, they are mobilized by the sense of uncontrollability, by the loss of control. People who lose control over the world, who lose control over politics, who lose control over their life, over their fate, they believe in conspiracy theories. I have no control over my life, somebody needs to have this control. So, and I think that this conspiracy theory is based on the loss of control among the conservative men, and particularly about their family life and about the political realms. And when you look at what happens among young people, in many countries, but also in Poland, among young people, the lifestyle of young people and the values they have are very, very far from those theories. So they are losing, I would say that the demography, the natural process will basically make this theory completely irrelevant. And already now it's much less fashionable just because it's part of the power discourse, it's part of those who have power. And we know that real conspiracy theory cannot be a top-down process. It has to be anti-regime, anti-establishment. Thank you.
Thank you. Michał, I really enjoy this idea of fragile religiosity. It sounds very kind of akin to fragile masculinity, like when you when you were describing what it means. I wanted now maybe to move on from social psychology to political sciences, if that's okay, and ask you, Patrycja, for your take on the book. I feel that, you know, if it connects with Michał, he's connected, but if it's a completely different approach, then also we would love to hear that.
It will be connected in a way to what Michał has just said, but also to what Elżbieta said, that you were looking for this international context as well, and you were giving a toolbox, an analytical toolbox, to look at populism in a way. So, I mean, just by way of introduction, and I only have a couple of minutes, as I understand, I want to say that the book is brilliant, it's timely, it's important, and it's readable. Which not always is the case when it comes to Routledge. So, and I'm not saying this in jest, it really is, and you will see for yourselves. So I want to touch on one thing, the similarities with other phenomena, and this is what Michał did with anti-Semitism. I want to do the same with jihadism. Okay, so I think that there are many similarities, and I will take out 10 of them, between anti-gender politics and jihadist ideology. It doesn't have to be necessarily jihadist, but it's Islamist extremism, okay, also, whatever you call it, whether there is this violent component or not. So let's dwell on this a bit. The religious trend and tones, obviously, you know, the Quran says this, we have moral superiority, we know what the text says, other people don't, we are the believers, the others are infidels. The political struggle. Jihadism is a political movement, right? You need adherents, you need followers in order for the ideology and the group to strike, so there's this political tone there. Emphasis on economic deprivation, or playing on economic deprivation and neoliberalism, or critique of neoliberalism. This is also omnipresent in jihadist discourse. And they really do play on economic deprivation, because we're talking about a region that is economically deprived, right? Not only in relative terms, but in absolute terms. So it's important. anti-colonialism and anti-elitism also. So I also found this anti-colonial note very interesting. I mean, we're talking about, and I'm talking about the Middle East and the Arab world, and it's a world that had been colonized, right? So in reality, but there's new kind of colonialism, like the anti-gender politicians claim, and so do jihadist ideologues as well. We are now being colonized, and actually the effects of the former colonization in history are our elites. These are the new colonizers, so we need to stand against them. Anti-globalism, and of course, you know, all global processes were engendered by the United States and the West. We have a different idea for our movement. We need to stand up to globalization. NGOs as foreign agents, right? You also mentioned that in your book. So, you know, NGOs are foreign agents. Even if they are local, grassroots, you will always find, you know, 100 euros that were donated from an organization in Europe. So that discriminates. They are the agents of Western powers. Saving the family, you know, the family, the same family. Everything is for the family. If you don't have family, you're not really a woman, you're not really a man. You're a slave, actually, if you don't have family. So we're here for the family values. And this is connected with communal values over individual ones, of course, right? So we're a community, we're al-ummah. We are the group together. So communal values above individual ones. Being, or the mentality of being an avant-garde of the struggle. So we are the ones who understand what needs to be done. We are the ones who understand social reality. Others don't. And since we do, we are a special group. We're the avant-garde of the change, right? We need to move things forward and tell the people what things really look like. They want to destroy its mentality, right? So we're under threat. We're under constant attack. We need to, you know, we need to be, like you're saying, Poland is, you know, the first avant-garde to brace against the attack on Christianity, right? So the same as in jihadist ideology. We will save Islam. Islam is under attack. Right, so these are the 10 similarities that sort of are interwoven in your book here and there. And so, in a nutshell, I think we're looking at, you know, so there are those two groups of kids. They have different colors of plastiline, different names, different places, maybe even different colors of skin, but eventually they create the same shape. So I found this fascinating, really. It was as if I was reading about jihadism. And now, as to your conclusion, I found it really interesting what you're saying about this ideological coherence. So that the combination of right-wing populism with the critique of neoliberalism and globalization is so coherent, and therefore it is so powerful. And I think if I were to take one thing from your book, I think it's this conclusion, that coherent ideologies play a role and are very powerful, and people buy into them. That leads you to the conclusion that also feminism for the 99%, which might be a coherent ideology, is a sort of way forward. And here, like Michał, I guess, I have a little bit of reservations. I mean, instead of maybe giving the content of the new ideology that will sort of stand up to anti-gender politics, I would focus on the mode and sort of emphasize spontaneity, authenticity, energy, so the mode kind of side of it, rather than the content side of it. Because the moment you talk about the content, it's as if, hey, we have this content, just follow it, right? I think it's a bit dangerous, but I mean, you know, this is just from a theoretical point of view in terms of, you know, what I think as a citizen, and, you know, we all know that probably we're on the same page here, but it's a little bit dangerous. That's my final thanks.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting, those analogies that you all, that you are able to map in, right, from anti-Semitic conspiracies or the jihadist ideologues. And in your book, you also see parallels to different populist trends elsewhere. And I'm wondering if there is kind of a solution that lies in the fact that there work in a similar way. But I leave that question for later, and maybe.
I've known about the project for some years because Agnieszka and Elżbieta and I would work together and we've discussed the ideas on several occasions. And as Elżbieta has said, there have been other people working on this idea that there is this kind of conspiracy, conspiracy theory of agenderism and so on. And so I was interested in reading about this, but of course, that's not the only thing that's in the book. And I would say that there are three kind of aspects of three modes, if you will, of the writing, which I could identify, and all three are, I think, important and interesting. One is this, very historical, almost chronicle-like explication of what has happened on both sides of the political conflict. Both within Poland especially, but also in other places in Eastern Europe and even more globally. And that's really interesting to read. It's very well documented what you do there. And that in itself is very worthwhile. Another modality which is connected to this is the modality that I would call the modality of testimony, which is when you talk about the anti-genderists, you look at them from the outside, obviously, and you analyze their discourse, you try to get into their hands, as Agnieszka was saying, but that's a very different modality from the modality that is in effect when you are writing about the let's just for simplicity's sake say genderists, side of the conflict, because then you are talking about your own memories also, your own impressions, your own readings of what people were saying and why and so on and so forth. And that's really also very interesting, and I would just want to make the distinction between those two modalities, even though they're obviously connected in the writing. So for example, when you write about the black protests, that testimonial aspect is very, very important. And for me, because I took part in some of the demonstrations, it was also kind of very touching and brought back memories and so on and so forth. And thirdly, there is this theoretical aspect, which is when you talk about populism and the connections there. And this is something that I really don't know least about, I guess, but I also find it very interesting. For instance, you invoke Chantal Mouffe and talk about how there is a kind of moment for populist politics, and that moment carries a certain promise. And this promise is perhaps most readily visible in the context of Latin American politics more than in Europe, for example. But that's really quite interesting. And you don't just read populism, and she doesn't just read populism as something completely negative, but there is a certain political promise that comes with it. A promise of rejuvenation, of a kind of alternative to the politics of, let's say, the spectacle and so on and so forth. So a kind of connected term, which I actually at the moment cannot remember if it comes up in your book or not, but it's also her term, articulation theory, which is something that Agnieszka was in fact talking about, right? People who talk about family values may be speaking out against the kind of neoliberal condition that they live in without being able to call it that, or without being able to put their finger on that precisely, but instead they talk about family values or conservatism and so on. So all of this is really fascinating, and all those aspects are there, and they are very well articulated in your writing. So I want to congratulate you on that, and thank you. At the same time, speaking of the black protest, okay, here's where I kind of want to ask a question, I guess. I mean, I had this very strange sense of reading something like an alternative version of history when I was reading that chapter. And the reason for this is because on several occasions in the chapter you say this was such a successful movement because it stopped the legislation. However, we know what happened since. We know what happened about a year ago. And in which the black protest movement is a complete failure. It hasn't worked. I mean, it has consequences which we may say are still with us, if they're positive, or at least they still carry some of this populist promise. But they haven't worked in terms of policy. And what has happened can be, I think, perhaps described by analogy with what has happened in the US, where you had Donald Trump, who was installed in power among other electoral forces by the evangelicals, by people who ran abortion and so on and so forth. And it wasn't because he was himself religious or especially conservative or anti-abortion. It was because they were counting on him installing, Supreme Court justices who would be presumably against, for example, access to abortion. And in fact, this is what happened. There's a very interesting play which I wrote about in Dialogue several months ago by Will Avery called Heroes of the Four Dimensions, which is essentially about that, about this logic of why Donald Trump was important for the religious extremists or right-wing extremists who are also religious extremists in the US. And it's because of the question of abortion and justices. And of course, what happened in Poland, in a way, is a kind of replay, however, there are, of course, differences, and perhaps the way that this has happened is sort of less finessed in the Polish case, but essentially what happened here is also an example of court party, right? I mean, we have the Constitutional Court, the tribunal, which was packed with people who then kind of followed the will of the party that has put them in that court, right? And so the logic was, if we cannot have legislation, we'll have a court ruling, which is of course parallel to the US in the sense that I just recently attended a seminar with someone, I have to look up his name because I can't remember his name, Christopher Pepin-Neff, someone who worked for, he's a professor at the University of Sydney, and he used to work as a lobbyist for LGBTQ organizations in the US, and now he's a political scientist. And what he talked about in this seminar was his belief that in the US context, the Democrats are unable to influence the composition of the Supreme Court, and that they will, that they have lost the fight, essentially, and that it's just a matter of time before Roe versus Wade is overturned, and abortion is in some way made inaccessible to many women in the US, because it will go state by state, and in many states there will be restricted access to abortion. We are beginning to see that, of course, with the example of Texas and some other states already. His further argument was that other cases of the Supreme Court which kind of rest on this doctrine of privacy in the US context, the right to privacy, that they will also fall. So Obergefell, for example, the question of same-sex marriage and so on, he thinks this is just like a dynamo theory of things that will just collapse, and that we'll see this happening very soon. I don't know whether he's right or not, but my point is, we are looking at something like this here, and it doesn't seem to be that the politics of populism and the populist promise necessarily helps. I mean, I think it helps in certain ways. I think it's good to have a movement, but clearly that's not enough. And what is needed is some kind of institutionalization, a political party, a lobbying group. I don't know. I don't really have an answer. But I mean, without that, there will not be success. And so that's my one and only, but I think, I don't want to say major, but a kind of, heartfelt sort of a critique of the book in the sense that it seems to me that there is a kind of promise that you're articulating, which I don't necessarily find credible anymore.
Thank you. It's this image of the snowball effect of rights being taken away kind of froze me for a moment. So thank you for painting that picture for us. And now, with a smooth segue to Ludmiła to maybe pick us up a bit from this grim perspective of the future, or let's go even further down into this pessimistic rabbit hole. But I wanted you research kind of westernization of Poland, also the ways in which neoliberalism plays out on gender roles in Poland. So I wondered, how did you receive this book, and what you can add to this panel?
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, the book, of course, is extremely good, and it was a great pleasure to read it. My favorite moment, maybe this is the approach. There are many juicy passages for a person who's interested in the Polish transformation. For example, the moment when the authors indicate that after being so tired with the catching up with the West narrative, which is what I've been studying, so this very kind of hegemonic idea of the 90s that Poland has to catch up with the West. One of the advantages of anti-gender discourses is this change of the tables and saying now Poland no longer catches up. Now we are in fact the avant-garde of moral revival in the world, and all eyes are set upon us because we will lead the world towards moral rebirth. And this is, I think, something very interesting. And all this moment when you write about dignity discourses and how anti-genderism responds to neoliberal threat with new ways of regaining dignity. And my favorite moment in the book is the moment when you analyze one short video spot of a campaign which is not explicitly anti-gender campaign. This is the spot which I suppose everyone remembers here. Don't put your motherhood off, which was released by Fundacja Mamy Taty. And I love this moment because this is something I know, and after reading their analysis, I completely kind of changed my mind, and I finally understood what's going on in this campaign. And as you probably remember, there was this young woman in her 30s, wealthy, successful. She traveled the world, she has a great job, but she cries at the end because she did not have children. Supposedly she cannot have them anymore. And explicitly this campaign seems to be saying that well-off women should reconsider their life choices and have children as if they still can have them. So when I watched it, I thought, well, it's about me. Obviously, I am this lady, career-oriented, no children yet, and I'm going to try sooner or later in 5 years. So, and with this approach, of course, I thought it's ridiculous, and nobody is going to buy this campaign. This is basically a complete misfire. And our authors tell us that this is completely not the case. This campaign is not directed at young women who are career-oriented. This campaign is directed at the other women who actually have children, who are happy with having big families, but who are less successful with the cutthroat neoliberal market. And this is in fact some kind of consolation prize. And I think in many ways, in your book you suggest that anti-gender campaign is, I mean, you don't use the term, I'm not sure whether you would agree with the term consolation prize, but in many ways this book suggests that one of the appeal, part of the appeal of the anti-gender movement is this consolation prize it offers for women, especially for women, who are not as successful with the rat race that neoliberal market got us. And of course this is important because it's polarizing. This is important because it involves a lot of affect, which is in fact this negative affect of this feeling of superiority, but also, again, regaining dignity in this, dignity in the face of a kind of neoliberal difficulty. Yeah, and this is what I wanted to share. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ludmila, for this comment. And I love the approach of my favorite moment in the book. It's kind of like, a first year review kind of a situation. Like, well, what I loved about the book was. But I think it's very relevant. And now, I mean, Ella, you were worried of the deluge of criticism that will go your way. I don't think it happened, so sorry to disappoint. I think
I'm quite happy to be disappointed. Thank you.
Yeah, these are the kind of disappointments that we're happy with, right? But I think the challenge for you now is to try to respond in some way to either some points that are that have been mentioned, or provide some kind of more holistic approach. It's up to you how you want to tackle. I don't want the violence. How you want to approach this. I think, very difficult task that you've created by selecting such a panel.
Can I answer the issue of the women's movement? Because obviously I'm quite a lot of my work is on that, and also this is the moment where my sort of activist identity comes in. So of course the one criticism that we can get is that we followed our wishful thinking in a sense, right? That we wish for this to happen, therefore we are more prone as scholars, as researchers, to see this happening. And it might be the case. I mean, I don't think that impartiality is something that we will be thinking of as the most important element of our identity as researchers. But what we are trying to show, what I'm thinking about, is that if we look at the experiences of, let's say, Argentina and Ireland, which are the two examples of very conservative countries, especially Ireland, right, where the issue of abortion has been included in the constitution, right, where the Catholic Church has enormous political power for quite a long time, and in that sense it can be seen as similar to Poland. We can see the elements of this process of dismantling this grip over the politics of the sphere of politics and the people's minds and souls in the Polish context, right? And I think about this mass mobilization which started in 2016, very much in terms of how the authority of the church, in a Weberian sense, has started to crumble. And I think that this process is irreversible. So in that sense, I guess what we will need for this to be translated into specific types of political changes would be, of course, the change of government, right? We had it in the Irish case, right? First, you started this process of crumbling of the authority of the church, and of course, there were other issues as well. And then, on the ground of this, you could have the Murphy Commission, you could have the citizens panels, right? The whole process. It was a long-term process which resulted in repealing the aid. And I think that what I see very clearly in the Polish example is the beginning of this process. And of course, as a social movement scholar, I have to, and as a sociologist, I have to be humble in the sense that we are much better equipped to understand why something happened than to predict if and when something will happen. But I think that this issue that we are talking about, this moment where the women's movement becomes a mass movement and claims the will of the people, is also a very important moment of political transformation. First of all, because of the politicization of a whole new generation of women. And I see it, I mean, I'm teaching social movements here at the center, and it's quite interesting that in 2018, when I started to do it, when I talked to people, young people, have you been at a demonstration? They were like one person, yeah, I happened to be there. Now, there's like almost everybody says, yes, we have experience with social movements, right? So this has become a very wide-scale experience. And I think that this process of politicization will have ultimately political effects, right? And another element is also, and I'm looking at Eva Majewska here, who wrote about the weak resistance as a paradigm for struggle. And I think this is extremely important to see a new paradigm of a political struggle, which is not very much concerned with, single heroes, which we dealt with during Solidarity times and after. And I know that this type of resistance has a lot of troubles with entering the media, for example. This is not very popular. But I think that the women's movement, especially this mass movement that we have today, is doing a great work in trying to really promote this collective, unheroic type of resistance, which understands that this is a long-term battle, but which actually, I see a very strong ground for developments similar to the ones which we saw in Argentina and in Ireland. Although, as I said, there is an element of hope, I guess, that is imbued in my thinking. So I'm not sure if it will happen, but I see every element of the structure which might allow it to happen.
Agnieszka, would you like to pick up any strands of?
Yes, I guess I would like to be a little bit more modest, I guess, in my defense of the chapter on black protests. As you probably know, academic presses take a long time to publish books. So this one was ready before the tribunal's verdict. That's kind of the embarrassing version. The version that I'd like to leave you with is that we are dealing with a movement that happened in 2 stages, and we didn't cover the second stage. I think we'll both end up writing about it. The first stage was a rebellion of women who identified with their state, hence a lot of patriotic imagery, for instance, in those protests, and was facing a rising populist right, but still in what seemed to be a democratic society. 4 years later, we're dealing with authoritarianism. It's a very different context, and this movement was much more radical. It was hopeful, but I think it was also filled with despair, and most of its symbolism suggests that this is a generational upheaval of people who are basically, and I cannot use profanities because this is being streamed, but right, you know what I'm saying. This is a revolutionary movement. And also I think it is worth remembering, and that's the success that we were pointing at, that the first wave, the 2016-2017 wave of the black protests, did cause the first major withdrawal of policy on the part of Greece, so that it was a real policy win. And I guess we are looking at it from the point of view of the women's movement, which has never really had a success in Poland. We've been around for 20 years, and we got the quotas, sort of, right? So this was big, and I think it was a formative experience for a lot of women. But it's also true that this book was being written as these things unfolded. So you will find that the Polish edition is a little bit more up to date. It will come out in Krytyka Polityczna in March. Okay, may I speak to some of the other?
Yes.
Okay.
Very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. I guess I will have to, meet with Michał Bilewicz somewhere and discuss this stuff, because I've actually written another article which is in the press about the anti-Semitic subtext of the anti-gender movement, and I'm very intrigued by some of the things you said. And I think it's there, and I think they know it. I think they're also very busy hiding it. In other words, not only is there a similarity, but there's also a continuity. And you showed me some of the links that I was not aware of. I'm not sure I share your hope that these conspiracy theories will taper out, because this new generation of men is so much more flexible and sure of their. I don't know. I mean, maybe you know different men than we do. What I see is the spread of a lot of conspiracy theories quickly, not the least of which are connected to COVID, of course. As far as Patricia Sasnel's analogy, I find it fascinating. I know very little about Islamist extremism. One of the things that we looked at is the way that Muslims were drawn into the anti-gender movement, both at the top. They were occasionally invited in the 90s and early 20s to the big events of the World Congress of Families and so on, and then they somehow disappeared, and we weren't quite sure what to make of it. There was also an episode, I think in 2011 in London, where one of the anti-gender campaigns located at schools was actually directed at Muslims. So there were these uneasy efforts to include, I'm not sure about extremism, but certainly these religious alliances. As for your claim that we would like feminism to be more coherent and to counter anti-genderism as such, I don't think we say that. We actually are quite critical of this dogmatic anti-capitalist rhetoric of the feminism for 99%. like on one hand we embrace it and we appreciate this theory's populist aspect, the idea that it is time for feminism to embrace emotions, and we love that is happening. So that would be mode. We love the fact that feminism is claiming to represent the people and to articulate the people very broadly. But I don't think we ever state that we wanted to have a robust ideology. We actually had quarrels about this because I'm much more dogmatic than Elżbieta, and she would say, like, you know, hold your horses. Not everyone would want to share that. So yeah, I think we're innocent on that account, although we may have carried things too far occasionally. I'm really happy that Liwa shares my fascination with this clip. I spent a lot of time with it, and then we fine-tuned it together. We don't talk about consolation prize for women. We do talk a lot about the revaluation or of care and parenthood. And we think that what's actually at stake in a lot of this discourse is that parents are told that being a parent is worthwhile. And that is something that has not been happening in Western culture in the last 20 years, and it's time to do it. And of course, we have a history of doing that in our books on motherhood. So that was really our angle. I mean, I'm not sure I would want to use the term consolation prize, but certainly it is a dignity discourse, offering, as you said, and you put it beautifully.
Yeah, but I was also thought about whether this is a good term, and I thought, well, actually how much anti-neoliberal, anti-gender discourse is, and because for men, neoliberalism seems kinda fine, right? This is the women who are kind of excluded, and because we kind of, what I thought, like, we all agree that women in current situation cannot have it all, right? Of course, the answer of feminism and the answer of anti-genderism is different, but men can have it all, so this is kind of not a problem here.
Well, ask the incels.
Or maybe not, because they will reply, and then you'll have to deal with that. Okay, sorry, maybe Agnieszka or Ella, would you like to?
No, I think we
Okay, so
space for.
because we don't have a lot of time left, I wanted to check with the audience. I think mostly the audience in the room. If you have questions or comments, but more questions, to either, and mostly the authors, but maybe do questions about some of the commentators' remarks. So now is the time to indicate that you do. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to try to speak loud. I don't know if I'm well heard. So thank you so much for this discussion. It was very.
If you could remove your mask for just a minute, is that okay to ask you?
For me, it's fine. I'm not sure about. Okay. Anyway, so thank you so much for the writing of the book, for making it available on in the open access. I'm really happy to hear it all, because for me the topics of anti-genderism and right-wing populism that you so cleverly and so interestingly discussed are a part of a larger package under the name of fascism, basically. So that's the word that I would use. So obviously my question would be, like, how about that? What stops you from taking this? I imagine this as a kind of large step, politically especially, to transform, the narrative from the narrative of. And obviously, I appreciate the specificity of the terms that you're using, because they allow to really clearly focus on your thematics. But obviously, as somebody coming from philosophy background, fascism is so. First of all, why not, or why yes fascism, or why not fascism in this context, like by using or not using this term? And this brings me to what Michał, Professor Bilewicz, was arguing about. This funny point you made, actually, interestingly, but also funny, about how it took only 20 years to build anti-gender. Come on, this narrative has like 5,000 years of patriarchy, basically. So it took actually like almost 3 times longer than to build the anti-Semitic narrative. And so I would like to reverse that, because I think you will agree. So basically, here is no disagreement. But the thing is that within the classical post-Marxist narratives concerning fascism, obviously this connection, this intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-misogyny, basically, this intersection has a history, also in the narratives that criticized fascism or radical right-wing. So I'm curious to what extent it's interesting for you to look at such fantastic people, but also crazy people, as some scholars would say, as Wilhelm Reich, as Klaus Teweleit, and this heritage that I know you know of, but I'm curious to what extent you know it's interesting for your analysis. And I would ask 20 more questions, but probably I have to stop. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this question.
May I? I think there's several reasons why we didn't use the word, although it came up in our conversations a lot. One is that it forecloses the discussion. Once you call something fascist, nobody listens, right? It's just like saying it's evil. And I think there is a way to, and we tried to unpack populism in a way that takes it away from its obvious, it's a bad thing, meaning in mainstream press. I don't think you can do it with fascism. Another reason is that the anti-gender movement is actually very diverse internally. And I think while there are people in it, and some of these people are at the origins of this conspiracy theory, and we talk about them. There's this radical Catholic traditionalist, David E. Jones, who is the source for some of the anti-Semitic versions. And he's obviously a fascist. I hope he doesn't sue me now. By this definition of fascism as an ideology. But there are people who are not. There are people who just think that this gender thing has gone too far. It's dangerous for children. The equivalent of the outraged matrons from the Legion of Decency who wanted to censor movies in the 1930s, right? They were not fascists, but some of the bishops who were behind the censorship mechanism, of course, were fascists, right? And if you look at their anti-Semitic accusations against Hollywood, it has a history, and it is in part a history of fascism. But I think if you limit it to that, then you miss a lot of the more mainstream versions, and it's actually the mainstream versions that interested us. But I think increasingly as the story goes on, we will be in need of using that word more, because things are getting rougher. Right?
And in a sense, I think that, as Agnieszka said, because the book has developed for quite a long time, if we would write it today, especially in the context of what's happening at the Polish-Belarusian border, where you could very clearly see that it's not about the discrimination or dehumanization of specific groups, but it's about killing specific groups, or at least allowing them to be killed or die, which becomes part of the Polish state policy or official policy. Then this is the moment where we definitely need to talk about fascism and how those fascist elements are becoming much more mainstream. And of course, the interesting question here is to what extent, and this is something that we can see also in other countries, to what extent the talk about gender and family values becomes a way to sanitize fascist policies and fascist groups. And this is something that I think we would agree with a lot, and I think that we have to have a discussion around.
Thank you.
Do you want to defend
I can defend my point a little bit still. I generally agree that the history of patriarchy is way longer than of any other group-focused entity in the world. But I think what is specific, and this is my learning from the book actually, is that anti-gender conspiracy theory is not necessarily just sexism. I mean, when you think about patriarchy, you usually think about more benevolent forms of sexism, of course, benevolent in scientific terms, right? So, but the portrayal of women as being weak and needing protection and so on, and of course it transfers into more hostile forms of sexism after as a response to the emancipation of women, basically. But I think that this whole anti-gender ideology is a very strange and vague ideology, vague conspiracy theory, which mixes homophobia with, you mentioned Reich, and I think it's part of that. I mean, the opposition against the Frankfurt School and some ideas that are neo-Marxian, right? I mean, that's also combined with it, although I mean, Frankfurt School was very conservative in terms of I mean,
Depends who.
It depends who, but
Horkheimer, yes, but not
Marcuse and Reich were on the fringes. I mean, the mainstream of Frankfurt School with Horkheimer and Adorno.
Adorno was not conservative at all. I have to emphasize.
So they are, but they bring it all together. So this is like this whole, as we call the potful gender, is the monster of gender, because it's the monstrosity as an important aspect of that. It was in fact developed 20 years ago. I mean, it's a new phenomenon. You wouldn't find anything like that.
But the Frankfurt School has to escape Germany in the rise of fascism. So to be honest, I think you're building an argument for me rather than for yourself. Historically.
No, I agree with some idea that it's part of the fascist, some form of fascist politics, and in respect with the Frankfurt School, thinking fascism as being a consequence of mass culture and of consumer mass culture. And in that respect, anti-gender conspiracy theory is part of that. It's also a pop culture phenomenon. But I think it's quite a new one. And how fast did it spread from India within the Catholic Church in the teachings of the Vatican to become such a popular issue is
Okay, Vatican also has a history of being misogynist, so we can. I think it's a big ping pong story that we can have.
Thank you for both the discussion. Do you want to follow up in any way?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to pitch into this discussion that my sense is that if it's a continuation of fascism, it's a continuation of a specific brand of mostly French fascism from the 1930s, which was very sexually repressive and which associated sexual perversion with Jewishness very strongly. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the strongest version of the anti-gender movement actually erupted in France. So culturally, there are fascist roots. But that, of course, doesn't mean that everyone who challenges the idea of gender is a fascist, right?
Okay. I think we have time, sort of, for one more question or comment. If there is any brave soul in the audience. Okay. No? Last chance? Okay. So, given that, and I promised you that I'll be the timekeeper, right? And I had one job, and I'm trying to do it well. So maybe I would like to ask the two of you for some kind of final comments, and if our panelists, there's a thought they need to express and that it may suffocate them if they don't, then you also have the time for it now. But other than that, I think that we'll draw this to a close. So starting from our wonderful authors, final thoughts. I mean, not final, but for today.
Well, I've been with this project for a long time. It started with the explosion of a smoke bomb, which is on page 1. And so it's been an adventure, and this has been a very worthy closure to that adventure. Of course, we'll keep the discussion going. We hope to get a lot of readers and responders, but thank you so much for being with us and for reading the book.
Yes, I also I have my notes, so I will think through them later, so thank you so much for that. And I would like to thank everybody who has made this possible. I would like to thank Grzegorz Kość, who has been really supporting us in this journey, and also to IDUB, who has supported the open access, and also to Tomasz, who has been also supporting us in this project, and to my own project manager, Håkan Johansson, who has been also supporting us with the issue of open access. So there has been a really team effort. So we really want to stress that and thank everyone on the way.
Okay, panelists, final thought that someone would like to share.
I sort of hesitate to speak up for the authors, but I just wanted to say how important it is that it is open access, and I think you sort of show the way how to go forward in the academia with academic papers. I mean, I know it requires a lot of money probably, but it's really important that it's open access.
Can't stop.
That would be really difficult.
say, if I were to summarize my points with one sentence, I would say, whatever it is, please make sure you vote.
This whole idea of feminist populism is something, because you suggested that it's a story of failure in some respect, but actually it's also a story of success, just because of the fact of changing values and changing attitudes of young generation. This is what has been won as part of the women's strike. It's the fact that it's now fashionable to be feminist. It's not, and it would never be so popular among young people if it was only Congress of Women with Henryka Bochniarz, right? I mean, this would never be. The idea, it's not something which can be catchy for the young generation. I think this is the main success of this populist turn, if we can call it a populist.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank Ella for giving us this hope that we are like doing the first step of the Irish steps or Argentinian steps. This is something I would like to hold to.
I hope we will witness that.
In our lifetime. Thank you so much to our authors, to the panelists, to the audience in the room, as well as audience in front of the screens. I also wanted to express my thanks to the many people, the entire village that made this project of the book, but also of today's book launch possible, among others, Karina Toka, who made it all work, and obviously a C director. So this is it for today.
And Marta, who has been a great moderator.
Full disclosure, I've got the questions and jokes prepared by the authors, so it's all legit. Anyway, thank you everyone, and that's it for today, and I hope that you'll get to talk more about this book and the issues that we raised. Thank you.